start all over, forget the pain, forget the man I loved in vain, and I just can't sleep.
She once ruled the airwaves, a golden voice that floated effortlessly across radios from Auckland to Melbourne. They called her Australia's Queen of Pop. But decades later, her name returned to the headlines not for a comeback, but for a court appearance involving methamphetamine. What happened to the darling of Australasian music? And how did a voice once compared to Dusty Springfield's become a whisper in the dark? Allison Durbin wasn't just another pretty face with a catchy tune. In the 1960s, she was a phenomenon. Her hit I Have Loved Me a Man wasn't just a song, it was a generational anthem. But behind the soft curls and beaming stage lights, Allison was carrying something she never sang about, a growing, invisible weight that fame could never lift. By the early 1980s, she was gone from public life. No explanation, no farewell tour, just silence. For years, whispers circulated. A failed marriage, depression, addiction. But Allison never spoke. Until 2007, when court documents and police reports revealed what the tabloids couldn't invent: methamphetamine possession, intent to supply, and a woman who once sang for presidents now standing before a judge. This is not a biography. This is the unraveling of a woman who once captivated a continent. We'll peel back the polished vinyl covers, the magazine clippings, the glamour, and look into the years where no music played, the years of loneliness, dissent, and quiet desperation. Because before she vanished, Allison Durbin tried to scream, but no one was listening. In the vibrant music scene of the late 1960s, New Zealand was experiencing a cultural awakening. While the rest of the world tuned into Motown, the Beatles, and psychedelic rock, the small island nation had found its own voice, and that voice belonged to Allison Durbin. Born in Auckland in 1950, she stepped into the limelight at a time when women in music were rarely allowed to lead. But Allison wasn't just a girl with a microphone. She was a presence, a sound, a style all her own. Her rise began in local bands, but it was her solo career that turned heads. With her rich contralto tone and emotional delivery, Allison stood apart. In 1968, she released I Have Loved Me a Man, a sultry, soulful track that soared to #1 and stayed on the charts for months. The song catapulted her to stardom, earning her the title of New Zealand's Entertainer of the Year. At just 18, she was a household name, and not just in her homeland. Australia welcomed her with open arms, and soon she was performing to packed audiences across both countries, her face gracing every television screen and teen magazine cover. What set Allison apart wasn't just her voice, it was her ability to cross cultural borders. She became a symbol of modern womanhood in Australasia. Glamorous, talented, confident. Her fame reached such heights that in 1971, she was voted Best Female Artist in Australia. An extraordinary feat for a New Zealander in a highly competitive and male-dominated industry. But behind the glamour, something was shifting. By the mid-1970s, the hits were slowing. Allison had married music producer Howard Gable and become a mother. On the surface, it seemed like the natural next chapter, a successful artist settling into family life. But in the press, her name began to appear less frequently. The once frequent tours and television appearances dwindled. There were rumors, whispers of career burnout, of creative disagreements, of personal struggles too difficult to face under the spotlight. What most fans didn't know then was that Allison wasn't just retreating from the stage, she was retreating from herself. The woman who once dazzled on stage in sequins and perfect eyeliner began to disappear into ordinary life, working odd jobs, even reportedly taking work in aged care to survive. Her voice, once the anthem of a generation, now only echoed in old vinyl collections and fading memories. Still, there was no scandal, no public meltdown, no official retirement, just silence. Until 2007, when headlines exploded with the shocking news. Allison Durbin, now in her late 50s, had been arrested and charged with possession and supply of methamphetamine. The woman once crowned the Queen of Pop was now standing in a cold courtroom, accused of crimes that seemed unthinkable for those who remembered her in her prime. And that's where our story finds its real tension, not in her stardom, but in her silence, in the missing decades. In the emotional undercurrent of a woman trying to escape a spotlight that once gave her everything and eventually demanded too much. In this story, we are not simply remembering a singer. We are tracing the slow fall of a voice that once defined an era, only to be lost in the dark years that followed. The beginning was golden. Allison Durbin's childhood in Auckland was modest, but music found her early. Singing in school productions and talent shows, her voice was already too powerful, too mature for a child. By the time she was a teenager, she had joined a local pop group, the Hits and Misses, and caught the attention of producers who saw in her something rare, raw talent matched with effortless charm. She was signed quickly, and the machine began to turn. At just 16, she released her first solo recordings, but it was the breakthrough of I Have Loved Me a Man in 1968 that catapulted her into a different orbit. The song wasn't just a hit, it was a phenomenon. Sultry, confessional, daring. It played like a torch song from someone twice her age. Allison's delivery was haunting, mature beyond her years, and deeply personal. The public was transfixed. Her success didn't stay confined to New Zealand. She relocated to Australia, the bigger market, where the competition was fiercer. But Allison held her ground. She quickly became a staple on Bandstand, The Go Show, and countless other music programs. Her appearances were polished but warm. She had a way of looking directly into the camera that made viewers feel like she was singing only to them. By 1971, she had reached the pinnacle of her career. Her duet album with Australian pop star John Farnham, Together, was a commercial and critical success. Their voices blended perfectly, his bright tenor, her soulful alto. The media dubbed them the golden couple of pop, and her name was now being spoken in the same breath as Dusty Springfield and Petula Clark. But the pressure was mounting. Fame came at a cost. Constant touring, media obligations, and the endless need to stay relevant in a rapidly changing industry began to erode Allison's foundation. As the 70s moved on, the musical landscape was shifting. Disco was on the rise, and the singer-songwriter era was taking hold. Allison's style, rooted in lush orchestrations and vocal drama, suddenly felt dated. Record executives began looking elsewhere. Still, she pushed on. She married Howard Gable, a respected producer who had worked on many of her recordings. The pairing seemed perfect, a musical match as well as a romantic one. They had a daughter, and for a moment, it seemed Allison had found balance. But the music industry is rarely kind to mothers. Opportunities grew scarce. Promoters, once eager to book her, were now investing in newer, younger acts. The phone began to ring less. By the early 1980s, Allison Durbin had quietly faded from the charts. There was no scandal, no public breakdown, just the cruel erosion of interest. She still performed occasionally, mostly in nostalgia concerts, but the days of sold-out arenas and screaming fans were over. And then came the silence. Years passed. Fans wondered where she had gone. Some assumed she had retired happily. Others speculated darker reasons. In truth, Allison had slipped into a different world, a world far from the limelight, one filled with disappointment, solitude, and the quiet gnawing of depression. Financial hardship followed. Her marriage to Gable ended in divorce. She took on odd jobs to support herself, reportedly working in nursing homes, her once celebrated voice now used to soothe the elderly instead of thrilling crowds. There were whispers of drinking, of loneliness, of a woman who once stood under stage lights, now unable to recognize her own reflection. But nothing prepared the public for what was to come. In 2007, nearly 40 years after her greatest hit, Allison Durbin was arrested in Victoria for drug-related charges. Methamphetamine, possession and intent to supply. The story shocked longtime fans. How could the sweet-faced girl from the 60s end up in a courtroom like this? It was the climax no one expected, but it had been building all along. The fame, the fade, the void that followed. This wasn't just the story of a pop star who lost her way. It was the slow unraveling of a woman whose voice once held a nation and whose silence became her prison. And while the world moved on, Allison was left to navigate the long, dark aftermath of forgotten fame. By the time Allison Durbin re-emerged in the public eye in 2007, she was no longer the sparkling teen idol who had once graced magazine covers. Her mugshot told a different story. Drawn eyes, tired features, the weight of invisible years bearing down on her face. The charge was severe: possession and intent to supply methamphetamine. But behind the legal jargon lay a deeper tragedy. The the story of a woman who had been slowly disintegrating, far from the public view. According to court documents, police had uncovered a small quantity of meth during a raid on her home in Victoria. What alarmed many wasn't just the possession, but the intent to distribute. For a brief moment, tabloids seized on the case, running lurid headlines like "From Pop Princess to Pusher" and "The Fall of Allison Durbin." But what they missed entirely was the why. In a rare statement following the court appearance, Allison said very little, but those close to her later spoke out. Friends described a woman who had spent decades in silent struggle. After the collapse of her marriage and career, she had battled chronic depression, financial instability, and an overwhelming sense of purposelessness. For someone whose identity had been built around applause, silence had become unbearable. Sources close to the case described her as isolated and increasingly dependent on substances to cope. Methamphetamine, cheap, numbing, and dangerously addictive, had become a way to escape. Whether she was selling to support herself or simply caught in the web of addiction remained unclear. The court showed leniency. She received a 12-month community-based order and mandatory drug rehabilitation. But the public judgment was harsher. Fans who had grown up idolizing her were stunned. Others, less forgiving, dismissed her as another celebrity cautionary tale. Yet the deeper truth was far more haunting. Allison Durbin was not a celebrity who had squandered fame. She was a woman who had been forgotten by the very system that once celebrated her. There were no interventions, no behind-the-music specials, no benefit concerts or industry handouts. She had vanished in the cracks between nostalgia and irrelevance, and no one had noticed. Her story was disturbingly common, especially for women in entertainment. The industry that builds you up rarely makes space for your decline. And for Allison, the price of being a pop icon in her youth was a profound aching invisibility in middle age. Journalists who followed the case reported that Durbin showed deep remorse. One described her demeanor as broken but lucid, like someone who had spent years trying to claw their way out of something they couldn't name. Others noted how carefully she tried to maintain her dignity in court, dressed modestly, speaking softly, avoiding eye contact with cameras. What stung most for longtime fans was not the scandal itself, but the realization of how long Allison had been suffering without anyone noticing. There were no headlines during the years she worked quietly in aged care. No curiosity during her absence from the spotlight. Only now, in the darkest chapter, had people begun to remember her name again. And that raises the uncomfortable question: what if her fall had nothing to do with fame at all? What if Allison Durbin's real story was not about drugs or disgrace, but about silence, abandonment, and the emotional cost of being forgotten? Because before the police came, before the arrest, before the courtroom and the shame, there were decades of quiet suffering. There was a voice that once lit up radios across the country, gradually fading until no one heard it anymore. This wasn't just a fall from grace. It was the slow suffocation of a woman who had once been adored and later simply left behind. At Aussie Uncovered, we don't believe in reducing a legacy to a headline. And in the case of Allison Durbin, there's far more to examine than a single court case or a single moment of collapse. Her story is not simply about fame and downfall. It's about how a society treats its forgotten stars, especially the women who once shone too brightly. Allison Durbin was a cultural icon in her era. Not just a successful pop singer, but a trailblazer. One of the few New Zealand-born artists to truly break into the Australian mainstream at a time when borders, both geographic and artistic, were difficult to cross. Her voice resonated across two nations, and her records, filled with longing, soul, and elegance, became the soundtracks to many young lives. And yet, we must ask, what support did she receive when the music stopped? The world often romanticizes the fall of a star, clinging to the drama while ignoring the human being underneath. But Allison's decline wasn't explosive. It was subtle, quiet, and deeply human. There was no overdose, no scandalous interview, no reality TV breakdown. There was only silence. And in that silence, a person unraveled slowly. Mental illness, depression, addiction, these are not tabloid topics. They're complex, intimate battles that few are prepared to face alone. Allison's choices cannot be excused, but they must be understood in context. How many former stars, especially women, face similar paths once they are no longer useful to the industry that once adored them? Fame gives, but it never teaches you how to live without it. We also believe the media failed her. After all, where were the articles checking in on her when she disappeared from stages in the 1980s? Where were the interviews exploring her transition out of fame? Why did her name only resurface when there was something salacious to sell? Even in the court coverage, few asked how a woman once so revered had ended up here. Most simply printed her mugshot and moved on. But what if someone had asked the harder question? Not what did she do, but what happened to her? At Aussie Uncovered, we don't shy away from difficult truths. And the truth here is layered. Yes, Allison Durbin made mistakes. But she also gave everything: her youth, her privacy, her voice to entertain a generation. She lived the fantasy the world asked for, and when it was over, there was no soft landing, no farewell. Our view is this: Allison Durbin deserves to be remembered for more than a courtroom moment. She deserves to be remembered for the way her voice made people feel, for the teenage girl who made history with a love song, for the woman who tried, quietly and without attention, to rebuild her life outside of the spotlight. Maybe the saddest part of her story isn't the scandal, it's that she disappeared so completely, and no one asked why. So now, we ask you, what does this say about the industry we idolize? About the way we treat our stars when they are no longer shining? And more importantly, what does it say about us? There are voices that linger, not in charts, not in headlines, but in memory. Allison Durbin's was one of them. The kind of voice that once wrapped itself around your soul on a quiet afternoon or spilled softly from a transistor radio in someone's first heartbreak. It was tender, full of ache and sweetness, and for a while it felt like she would sing forever. But forever doesn't exist in pop music. As the decades passed, her records gathered dust. The teenagers who once adored her moved on, grew old, and forgot. And Allison faded, not in some dramatic fall, but in a slow, quiet withdrawal from a world that no longer had room for her. That's the part that hurts the most. Not the arrest, not the shame, but that long silence, when no one wondered where she had gone. And yet, maybe that's why her story matters now. Because behind every golden girl of yesterday, there's a real woman trying to navigate today. Behind every vinyl sleeve, a life. Allison Durbin was more than a headline, more than a cautionary tale. She was a pioneer, a mother, a voice that meant something once. And even as the years grew heavy, that meaning never fully disappeared. Somewhere, someone is still humming "I Have Loved Me a Man." Somewhere, her voice is still echoing through a scratched record, across a faded memory, through the heart of someone who once fell in love to her song. We often talk about legacies in grand terms: awards, fame, records sold. But maybe Allison's legacy isn't about any of that. Maybe it's about the simple, haunting reminder that even the brightest stars need someone to listen when the music stops. Some stories are never told, but now you know.